thank you everyone for having me along, and thanks to the organisers. Must say the bar's been set very high today, so let's just pretend for a second that economics and liberalism is the glamorous industry of show business, and Jeffrey Tucker is, say, Grace Kelly, distinguished, articulate, well respected and successful. Everyone prepare yourselves for Lindsay Lohan. I'll do pretty much anything for attention, and you know there's going to be a car crash at some stage during this presentation, but you won't be able to look away. Incidentally, I believe it was bourbon for breakfast that got Lindsay into trouble, so I'll steer clear of that. Look, I'd like to set the scene for this discussion. There we go. First of all, I'm going to have a look at the key issues. Secondly, going to identify who our opponents are, and by our, I've made the assumption that everyone attending here today opposes curfews and bans and additional taxes on alcoholic beverages. So we'll identify our opponents. These people are advocates of prohibition laws, curfew laws and alcohol taxes. We'll talk about their motives, their arguments, and why their arguments don't hold water. And finally, we'll discuss some of the proposed solutions. We'll look at the solutions that are perhaps more populist with the general public. We'll look at the challenges they pose for civil liberties and those with common sense. And then we'll have a look at some of the solutions which I believe are a bit more practical. We are going to focus on the practical more so than the ideological or the theoretical. I won't be quoting Mises for this speech. I think I'll be the first person today to not to do so. So let's move to the issues. The government wants to limit our personal freedom. Here in Queensland, they want to enforce a curfew at 3 a.m, or they're at least considering a proposal for a curfew at 3 a.m. In my presentation, I guess we'll focus on Queensland and Australian law because that's where my experience has been. And I notice that most of you are not from Queensland because you're all so overdressed for today. Anyway, I'm sure you'll be able to extrapolate and apply what I say today to your local area as well. So we've also had additional taxes placed on alcopops, pre-mixed drinks, somehow coined alcopops. I guess it's the people imposing these taxes want you to imagine that everyone drinking these is the equivalent age of someone who would be on a seesaw. When in fact with pre-mixed drinks, most people who drink them are in fact sitting on the couch at home watching Friday night footy. They've stopped serving us spirits at the cricket. They only serve us light beer, and they've banned iconic Australian institutions like the beer snake. Everyone's seen the beer snake. It's where you collect as many cups as possible from around the ground, you get it together and you hold it up and you see how far around the stadium you can get your beer snake. That is now banned. So I guess there's another way of looking at it. There's another issue, and that's the issue that others feel like their freedoms are threatened. So someone might perhaps think it's slightly inconvenient while watching the cricket, while Mitchell Johnson's coming into bowl, to have 1,400 cups land on your head. People believe that their ability to enjoy nightlife is restricted by others. People are concerned they can't walk safely in their own city. And some of the titles that were suggested for my talk today, indeed the one I got was More Violence, Less Fun, or The Fun Police. And I like these titles, and they certainly convey a lot of the feelings I have when I've been arguing this, and a lot of the frustrations I've had. And although these titles accurately convey my feelings, I think to a certain extent they're also part of the problem in successfully prosecuting our case. In fighting our liberties, I think it's important that we also acknowledge that there is a problem, and that problem is alcohol-related violence. If we address the broader issue of alcohol-related violence, or alternatively the perception of alcohol-related violence, then I think we can be far more confident about retaining our freedoms going forward. The cause of liberty in the area of alcohol and alcohol restrictions in Australia will always have a large support base, and the support base of the punters. And we shouldn't take their support for granted. We should definitely utilise it in showing the vast amount of public support. But the case for liberty will only be successful, I believe, when we can also demonstrate that there are alternative policy proposals out there which will successfully result in a safer society. Unfortunately, I don't believe in the current environment it's just enough to be right. We also have to prove that we have an alternative. So I guess if I had my time for setting the name of today's talk again, I might call it Winning the Debate on Tackling Alcohol-Related Violence. Let me move on then to who are our opponents. These are the people who are out to get us. Us being patrons of the nighttime economy, and that's a thing. People who enjoy alcohol, they're separate. You can enjoy the nighttime economy and not enjoy alcohol, and vice versa. They're not necessarily the same. And of course, all freedom lovers in general. It's important to know your enemy in battle. It's important to know their arguments and to know what motivates them. Often what motivates them is fear. So, who are these people? They are people who don't like alcohol. They are people who inherently believe that alcohol is evil. They are people who've had a family member or close friend suffer from alcohol abuse. They could be people who've had an experience with alcohol-related violence, or they don't have to have had the experience themselves, they just might have been nearby. They are worrying parents, and they are some members of Parliament. I should say not all. There are some very good freedom-loving members of Parliament, but there are also some who have authoritarian tendencies. Now, these people are worried that there is an epidemic of violence throughout our streets. And it is shocking. It is absolutely shocking to see the amount of people who commit offences while out, for example, in Fortitude Valley. So this is from the government's Drink Safe period trial. This stat shows the innocent people represented in blue, and in the red, you might struggle up the back to see that, that is people who commit offences. This is from the government's own work. It equates to roughly 0.02% of people. These are the people that proposed curfew laws are out to get. It's absolutely, in my opinion, a media beat-up. It makes good news to talk about it, it might sell papers, but when we look at the facts that are there in front of us, they just don't support it. So we need to challenge the fear of these people who are afraid of the alcohol-related violence which they'll confront on the night out with facts. We need to challenge them with facts. Our opponents, particularly here in Queensland, were also the Clubs Association. Very important to distinguish the Clubs Association from the Hoteliers Association. The Clubs Association are the people who run your local sports club or your local RSL club or sometimes your local bowls club. When submissions were taken for the recent, it's called Red Tape Reduction Liquor Amendments Act or something, Queensland. When submissions were taken from the public, until a coalition of freedom-loving groups made submissions at the last minute, these people would have made up 80% of the public submissions on the Act. So they're a very politically active group. And what is it that they fear? Well, in my opinion, they fear people leaving their venues and stopping playing the pokies in their suburban venues and going out to bigger, larger venues in the city. So that's, in my opinion, their fear and their motivation. What did Clubs Queensland say? There's a few quotes from them here. One of them that I like: trading hours is probably one of the most conscientious social issues. And that knocked me away. I would have thought of all the social issues that we have out there, I would have thought that trading hours would have ranked well down on social issues, but not according to Clubs Queensland. It's high on the list. They also said, from recollection, there was an opinion shared around the table that between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. there's a significant amount of lawlessness and assault that actually happens in that time. And I guess the question there is, which table are they talking about? Where was this opinion being shared? So let's look at the figures on that. And here we see that in Fortitude Valley, this is the ambulance call-out rates at various times around the clock, starting going around, and we see that after 3 o'clock, the ambulance call-out rate drops off significantly to an amount not seen since prior to 11 p.m. In Surfers Paradise, it's even more pronounced and more ridiculous, really, that by 3 o'clock, the ambulance call-out rates already actually dropped to a level below 9 p.m. So is Clubs Queensland then going to suggest that they shut Surfers Paradise down at 9 p.m? That would be the logical outcome, I would have thought. I'd like to see them take that up. Maybe Clubs Queensland, rather than using recollection of opinions around the table, should investigate some of these stats. This is another one from Clubs Queensland. They also recommended that changes be made that mirror the Newcastle model, and that has slashed the rate of alcohol-fuelled assaults by more than 1/3. It's relatively true, that comment, but there's a few things that we need to point out about the Newcastle experiment. Newcastle's reduction in violence over the 5 years inclusive period was 26%, which was roughly around about the New South Wales state average. So independent of what Newcastle were doing, their their violent incidents reported on licensed premises declined the same amount as everywhere else. And there are actually other suburbs like Penrith, Campbelltown and Gosford that didn't have the heavy restrictions that Newcastle had around the state, that managed to reduce their violent incidents in licensed premises by more. So I would reject that necessarily the Newcastle plan was solely responsible for this, for the drop in crime. There's also a lot to consider. The Newcastle plan wasn't just a curfew. People will try and tell you that this is just because they shut clubs down. They had a lot of other proposals. Some of them were good, like businesses and communities working together to share information and try and work on the problem together. Logical thing. I'm surprised it wasn't happening before their plan, but whatever. And some of them a little bit bad, like a ban on shots or nips of alcohol or cocktails. So yeah, that covers off some of the arguments put up by Clubs Queensland. Who else? I'm trying to stay away. Who else are our opponents of freedom? They are health and professionals and medical associations. Now, let's look at some comments by one of the doctors, Dr. Lionel. I'm picking on him simply because he's here in Brisbane, but I'm sure you'll have one of these officials in your local capital city, wherever you are around the world. And so he said, again, that all we have to do is close 2 hours earlier and we will address all alcohol-related violence. Find that proposal a bit remarkable. He said we're mopping it rather than stopping it, which, at least that's catchy. And he said that on Wednesday morning, and I'm not sure what Wednesday morning has to do with Friday and Saturday, but okay, on Wednesday morning there are two. That's right, 2 operating theatres going all day at the Royal Brisbane Hospital. And I'm not sure, again, a lot of people aren't from Brisbane, but the RBH services the better part of northern Brisbane. So I'm not really sure how he can necessarily draw this correlation that just because a couple of operating theatres on Wednesday are chock-a-block, that there's somehow a link to alcohol-fuelled violence on Friday and Saturday nights. Where do these cases present from? That's what we've got to look at it. And his argument was nightclubs. Obviously, the RBH is right near Fortitude Valley. Obviously, all these cases that are presenting to us come from Fortitude Valley. And that's what I've heard him say, read it in the paper. But the truth is, the hospitals don't actually retain the data of where the people present from emergency, where they came from, what they were doing. So where do these figures come from? My guess is when you don't have the facts on your side, just use anecdotal evidence. But here is a study which no one will be able to read from the QISU. And this QISU went into hospitals over a 10-year period. They were contracted to do so, and they asked independently of the hospitals. They were commissioned to do this research, and they did ask where people came from. Don't take a photo of that one. The next one will be better. Okay. So this is what that tells us. Okay. This tells us that of all alcohol-related violence, almost 40% of it occurs at home. The second most is in public spaces. Third most is unspecified locations, and the fourth, down at 15%, is licensed venues. So even if every single one of those unspecified locations was in a licensed venue, it still would not overtake those instances that occur at home. So we're targeting a very small amount of people. Now, the real insanity of this, from my point of view, is that these people are promoting a curfew. They're promoting at 3 o'clock to kick everyone out from the fourth venue, which is a licensed venue, to either the second most venue, a public space, or the first venue, go back home. They're sending the people who are alcohol-fueled from a less safe to a venue where violence does not occur as often to one where it's more likely to occur. They're saying, go out, beat your mates in the taxi queue, go home, beat the wife, you're not our problem. I tried to think of exactly what the fear was that was motivating health professionals to hang on to these arguments, and I couldn't think of anything else but the fear of irrelevance, because they've invested so much in telling us these things and telling us what's good for us that if they are eventually proven wrong, they might feel somewhat irrelevant. So finally, we move on to the solutions. I can't stop that, Ben. Sorry. There's a couple of things I want to look at, and let's start on a positive note when it comes to solutions. And I generally try to avoid this, but let me start by looking at the drink safe trial period in Queensland. I'm conflicted to call a government proposal sensible, but let's judge this on the scale of all government proposals and say that these range of suggestions as a treatment, or as trying to treat the problem of alcohol-related violence, were relatively sensible. The first solution is probably the one that most people will take an objection to, but which is increasing police presence in the valley and walkthroughs. One thing that did strike me as odd before this trial period, though, is that in Fortitude Valley, this is a place where 60,000 people go on a Saturday night to enjoy themselves, the police presence before this period was between 4 and 6 people, which I think is extremely low for an area like that. They experimented with different rates of policing. They went up to 60, and I think they've settled on around about 20. The other two main suggestions, which I think were very positive, is engaging with NGOs to provide support and services at night times, and that happened all across the state. And that was proved to be very successful. And also looking at improving the coordination between venues and environmental factors. So again, I'm a little bit surprised, given businesses' vested interest in having safe patrons, that these sort of things weren't occurring earlier. But they actively coordinated the police, the ambulance services to work together and try and improve services, and it had a positive impact. They did some other things, and a lot of these, again, are common problems, or if you've heard anyone talk about the problems in nightlife, they will mention problems with transport. So the government targeted taxi zones and the supervision of taxi zones just finding how to get to your best area of public transport home, lighting, crowding, and access to public toilets. So I think as government programs go, a lot of the ideas there, although you may not agree with all of them, seemed relatively sensible. Now, the other thing I wanted to address was populist solutions. Now, in running the No Curfew campaign, we got a lot of suggestions from the public or various people. One of the things that they did suggest was increasing police presence. Again, I'm cautious on this. I think that maybe 4 for 60,000 people was a low number, but I wouldn't like to see very high levels of police presence. I'd be very sceptical about that being the be-all and end-all, the solution for alcohol-related violence, particularly, again, when we're talking about 15% of cases. Curfews and lockouts and taxes. Now, these are populist not from the point of view of the public, but they're very populist from lawmakers and decision makers. It's very easy for them to have people saying, we want you to do something about alcohol-related violence, and just slap a tax on it, call it the alcohol pop tax, and we're done. Or say we shut the clubs and we're done. It's a very easy step for politicians to make, and I think they're populist in that sense, but they don't actually work. And anyone, particularly with taxes, where you're forcing people underground, you're basically just altering people's behaviour. They will still access alcohol. They will still get it. The poorer people will actually be worse off and be forced to experiment with lower grades of alcohol, and there'll be health issues there. So any politician who was looking at evidence-based solutions wouldn't find that a good solution, but politically they do tend to find it easy. The other one is ID scanners. I was particularly surprised to see the amount of people who, on the No Curfew Facebook page who advocated for the use of these. Now, I'm fine with the business making their own rules, but I, as I imagine many of you are, very cautious about the idea of, you don't see their privacy policy, so you don't know how long they're retaining that information for. And I'm also worried about the next step. I can see these being centralised into government databases for the retention of information. Finally, I'm also concerned that one bouncer that you have a disagreement with can determine your future for the rest of the night, week or month. Perhaps get you out of, kick you out of a whole entertainment precinct for a long period of time because you had one disagreement with. I'm not sure what everyone else's experience is with bouncers, but they're not always the most reasonable people. Some of them are very reasonable, but if you get one of them on a bad night, I'd hate to see that being the reason why no one could ever come back to, why a single person could never come back and enjoy Fortitude Valley. So here are the solutions that I think should be promoted. The first one, again, the most controversial, but I'll cover it off. If we're going to have capacity limits in clubs, and many of you may believe that we shouldn't need to, but if we do, I'm accepting that as a given. I think they should enforce it. I think they should enforce some of the legislation that they've got rather than cramming X thousand people into one venue and then being surprised that someone got a little bit angry that they couldn't get a drink or that someone bumped into them. They should look at more localised regulations, and I think in some places, particularly like Brisbane, even smaller than city councils where appropriate. I think it's ridiculous to see states or federal governments trying to implement policy to address alcohol-related violence in licensed venues through taxes or blanket-wide lockouts. The nightlife at Service Paradise is very different to the nightlife at Toowoomba, different to Cairns, different to Mackay, and I think whatever legislation people agree on or however they choose to tackle the issue of alcohol-related violence in their area should be up to the locals in that area, and preferably, again, with the businesses. I know of some areas where the businesses have agreed to shut earlier to enable them to open earlier for breakfast. So they've made a call that they don't need to be open through till 5. It's more profitable for them to be shut before then and open up early for breakfast. I'm also okay with that if that suits that community. So I think that wherever possible, the regulations should be localised. I think we should go the other way. I think we should increase trading hours. The more we reduce trading hours, the more people try and cram their drinks into whichever session they have, the more they try and preload before they go out. It's counterintuitive, really. Let venues stay open as long as they want and let people leave in the staggered fashion that they normally do. You avoid the staggering and staggered fashion that they normally do. You avoid the strain on public transport. You aren't forced into looking for some of these solutions that are only created by these artificial timeframes. So I think that we should look at increasing trading hours, deregulating the transport industry. That will be tricky. The taxi licensees are very supportive of no curfew because obviously they don't want everyone coming into their taxi queue at 3 a.m. I'm not sure they'd be supportive of deregulating the taxi licences because those licences apparently hold significant value, but I think we need to look at ways to slowly deregulate the taxi industry so that people don't have to get limousine licences, which currently happens in Melbourne and in Brisbane, and I'm not sure probably other places, just to service the shortfall of taxis. That's absolutely ridiculous. And they should open mass transport up to private sector competition. I think this happens in some areas already. Reducing the barriers to entry. Now, it's very interesting that when Campbell Newman was Lord Mayor, they embarked on a program called Vibrant Laneways, and they offered more licences out to venues for cheaper rates for smaller venues, again in an effort to disperse crowds. And I guess the theme of all these solutions is that the more you disperse crowds around, the less likely you are to have violent incidents. And I think that's pretty much common sense. So I don't think that should be shocking or surprising to people. But we still have trouble communicating these within the public. And just while I'm on that, I'm not sure why these solutions don't get the same attention as the more drastic measures, the lockouts, the alcohol taxes, these sort of things. And it's easy to say the answer is media sensationalisation, and indeed I've already used that excuse, but I'm not sure it's necessarily true, and I think liberty groups, business advocates, people like ourselves have to do more in putting these arguments out there and putting these facts out there and debunking some of the problems with the suggestions that are coming from these people purporting for additional taxes, lockouts and curfews. Finally, yes, removing restrictions on location. Again, with a similar theme, it's ridiculous to, given everything that I've just said, then crowd the licences into precincts, as they call. If someone wants to open suburban pubs, we should lobby councils to be much more lenient in allowing people to operate small venues. Now, I think I've probably glossed over this, but it is still important. I mentioned that alcohol-related violence is, 85% of this doesn't occur in licensed venues, but I still think it's important as a whole that we acknowledge this as an issue and address it. So when apathy creeps in and when people start to neglect personal responsibility, that's when the nanny status will truly take over, and that's when the politicians opt for the easy solution. So I think the best thing that we can do, I believe it's an important part of our philosophy, to keep insisting on accountability and not allowing society to become lazy. And I believe that the best thing we can do, our continual long-term goal, should be to promote and advocate for a strong system of personal responsibility, and that ultimately will be our best tool against the nanny state, not only in alcohol-related violence, but across the board.